Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Strength and Hormones podcast. Today is another LOdown solo episode. We are going to be talking about the differences between PMDD, which is Premenstrual Dysmorphic Disorder, and PMS, or Premenstrual Syndrome. They are two very different conditions and or different symptomologies and causes. We're going to talk about what those are today, and also why sometimes they get confused with one another and what you should know about them. Now, we'll start with talking about PMDD, and then we'll talk about PMS after that. And I want to definitely cover some of the just natural treatment options and things to consider with both of these, because they can both be situations that afflict so many women and can cause everything from missed days of work to discomfort to depression and, decreased quality of life. So with PMDD, it's really defined as at least 5 symptoms in most menstrual cycles that have to do with severe mood changes and physical symptoms. So we're looking for at least 5 of these different symptoms, and these can vary far and wide. It can be cognitive related, so it could be like brain functioning and concentration related. It can be more mood related, but in the DSM-5, it's actually defined as a depressive disorder. So most commonly we see more low mood and depressive type symptoms with PMDD, but there are other criteria as well within that generally are going to afflict more of your brain, but that also may cause some physical body like inflammatory type symptoms. And I believe that that's really where the overlap can exist. With PMS, it is a little bit less intensive, the symptoms. So there isn't really like a diagnostic criteria for, you need to have more than 5 of these symptoms to classify. And everyone's symptoms might differ. You might not experience them every cycle as well. So those are just some things to take into account, and they're generally not going to be nearly as severe or debilitating, and especially within the mood category as PMDD would be. So with PMDD, we see diverse changes in mood, cognitive function, so how your brain is working, appetite, so we can see changes in increased appetite, generally as a byproduct of depression. And we can also see experience disturbances in sleep patterns. And this is also a PMS symptom, but generally women will notice that they are getting lower quality sleep. They're not able to get as much REM and deep sleep, dealing with more insomnia related issues, difficulty falling asleep as well. And this can be because of some of the hormonal changes that happen during this time. The prevalence of PMDD ranges from about 1 to 8%. So it's a very small prevalence of the population, I would say, especially if you think about just 1%, maybe 8% is a little bit greater, but it's definitely more rare. I would say more commonly, which is, I'm not even sure the exact statistic is out there, but I would say in practice, we see probably about 80% of women that are experiencing more PMS specific symptoms. And the PMS symptoms are things that can easily be supported through some of the hormonal and nutritional strategies that we're going to talk about today. So with PMDD, there is definitely some hormonal aspect to it, and that's probably the main aspect that drives PMDD. We see that women with PMDD have higher levels of progesterone during the mid-luteal as well as the late luteal phase, or during both or either of those phases. So the luteal phase in general, remember, is that time period between ovulation and your first day of your period. So it's generally about a 2-week time period, somewhere between 10 to 14 days. And that generally is going to fall somewhere between day 20 to day 30 of your cycle, or day 14 to day 25. It really just depends on when your ovulation time period is happening. And this is one of the reasons why I'm such a big fan of cycle tracking, because it's not really about how long your cycles are or when you're having your period. It's more so about when you're ovulating that really is going to make the biggest difference in your cycle regularity and your overall hormone levels and things that you're experiencing on a 30-day basis. So women with PMD have higher levels of progesterone. I think it's often thought that women with PMDD have low levels of progesterone, and we're going to talk about why that misconception lies today. But we also see higher cortisol levels for women that have PMDD during the late luteal phase. And it's thought that maybe there's just decreased reactivity of your adrenal glands. So basically, your adrenals can't handle the stressors that are causing the cortisol spikes. And so women during this time might experience more anxiety, more difficulty sleeping, more rumination, and thoughts of obsession and things of that sort, because of the altered state of that cortisol dysregulation that the body is more prone to in that late luteal phase. So in those couple of days before you start your period. We also see prolonged exposure to or withdrawal from high levels of progesterone that may exacerbate those symptoms. So that just means that you notice more of the effects of when that progesterone drops off. So remember that in the luteal phase is really the only time of your cycle when you're making progesterone. And then it starts to drop off in that late luteal phase right before you start your period. And when you start your period, you're at the lowest hormone output. So there's very minimal levels of progesterone, very minimal levels of estrogen, really from like day 2 on. And then those levels of estrogen start to slowly build, but then progesterone doesn't really build until after that LH surge around ovulation. So there's kind of this like big drop off of both of those hormones. You go from a really high hormone phase in the mid-luteal phase where you've got lots of estrogen, lots of progesterone circulating to very minimal levels in a very short time period. And women with PMDD are more afflicted by that drop off of those hormones and that variability between that high hormone output and that low hormone output. It's very similar to what we see with like postpartum depression, where again, it's that drop off of during pregnancy, you had thousands of milligrams of estradiol in the system and your progesterone levels were the highest they've ever been. And now there's extreme drop off once you have the baby. And it's that drop off that can cause more of the depressive type symptoms and more of these mood related disturbances. So it all comes down to this thing called allopregnanolone. And we actually talked about this a little bit in my episode that I did with Dr. Michael, I'm blanking on his last name, but it was on hormone replacement therapy. And we talked about allopregnanolone. And one of the things he mentioned was that if you give a dog allopregnanolone, that it will calm them down. And we talked about why that allopregnanolone is such an important piece. But this is actually what we know to be true about PMDD as well. It's not necessarily the progesterone that's the issue. It's how you're metabolizing the progesterone that's where the issue lies. So with any hormones that we make in the body, it's not just about are we making adequate levels of those hormones? But then we have to think of as step 2 is, are they getting to the receptors that are on your ovaries, that are on your brain, that are all over the body to actually have the action that we want them to? And then the third step is, how are we removing them? How is our body metabolizing them and getting them out of the system so that we can then go back to making more of that hormone? And so with progesterone, it can take 2 different routes. It can go down what we call the 5-alpha pathway, it can go down the 5-beta pathway, and allopregnanolone is that 5-alpha pathway. And some people genetically are more prone to the 5-alpha pathway. We find that people that are more prone to the 5-alpha progesterone pathway typically are more prone to that same pathway as it relates to testosterone metabolism. And that pathway is actually what creates a lot of the androgenic symptoms. And so those are things like acne and facial hair growth and hair loss on the head, weight gain in the abdominal region for women. So that's one of the benefits to when we're testing hormones is by testing in urine, we can actually look at not just the overall hormone level, but how that metabolism is occurring. And that can tell us a lot of insights into where the issue is coming into play, especially with something like PMDD. And we can see if maybe you do prefer more of that 5-alpha pathway. So it's that allopregnanolone that is the biggest issue. We find that there's kind of 2 ways that you can suppress these PMDD symptoms. You either get progesterone to a really low amount to where there's virtually no progesterone being made, or you increase progesterone. So what the research has found is that when women have a moderate level of progesterone, so what we would consider to be physiologically normal, that is kind of the optimal level for progesterone, which I would say is somewhere around like 15 to 20 in that luteal phase. When women with PMDD are at that optimal level of progesterone, that's actually when they're more symptomatic. And so if we can take 2 different routes to be able to reduce symptoms. You can either suppress progesterone or you can increase progesterone. And so that's why the common treatment approaches for PMDD are either put you on an oral contraceptive because that's going to block ovulation, it's going to shut off progesterone production, or supplement you with bioidentical progesterone because that's going to raise your progesterone levels above the physiological level to a level that's going to get you out of that middle ground territory. So it's really fascinating that both of those strategies work really well, and which strategy you should take can depend on so many different variables. I couldn't tell you that on this podcast episode specifically. But they found that at a dose of around 200 milligrams of progesterone, women with PMDD had the lowest irritability. So 200 milligrams is a pretty high dose of progesterone replacement. It's not crazy high, but it's definitely on the higher end for sure. And that's where the research found that there was actually the lowest irritability. So there's something that's called the paradoxical GABA response. GABA you might have heard of before. It's a very important component to neurotransmitter production and overall mood in our brain. But they found that in women that have PMDD that have this progesterone going down that alpha metabolism pathway, that progesterone actually becomes the opposite of what it does in other people's bodies. So generally we think of progesterone as being a very calming, relaxing hormone. But in women that metabolize that progesterone down that 5-alpha pathway, they found that it's paradoxical. It does the opposite. It actually makes you very stimulated. And it's that stimulation effect that then can cause things like the insomnia, the sleep difficulties, the anxiety, the mood disturbances, the kind of more difficulty concentrating type symptoms because of how that progesterone is metabolizing. So what can we do to be able to help that isn't just suppressing progesterone or increasing progesterone? We can actually inhibit this 5-alpha pathway. And like I said, a lot of times women that have more of the progesterone going down the 5-alpha pathway for progesterone also do for testosterone. And so we can actually kind of kill two birds with one stone, which I always love doing. And there's a couple of different compounds that have been shown to actually inhibit this pathway. One of those that you might be familiar with that we talked about on the episode where we spoke about spironolactone and different acne treatments is called saw palmetto. Saw palmetto is a berry that has been shown to be a very potent 5-alpha inhibitor. And it can be something that you can supplement. It's not really something people consume. I don't know that I've ever seen that as an available berry option at the supermarket, but it's definitely a very easily usable supplement that can be utilized. And it can be used for both men and women. For men, it's commonly used for male pattern baldness because men can also have testosterone go down this pathway. But for women, we can use it for both the 5-alpha testosterone issues and the progesterone issues. Reishi, you might be familiar with, is a adaptogenic mushroom. That can also be something that can be really beneficial as it also blocks that 5-alpha pathway. And reishi also has some adaptogenic and immune modulating effects. So there are potential other benefits, and that might be why you may choose to go with reishi over saw palmetto, is just because you're getting other benefits like the support to your adrenals, as well as the benefits to your immune function as well. Stinging nettle root, you guys probably know, is one of my absolute favorites. It's great for so many things. It's great for stabilizing your mast cells to help reduce histamine intolerance issues. It's great for providing you tons of minerals for functioning as an adaptogen. But yet again, it also supports 5-alpha metabolism, and it actually inhibits this pathway. So that's something you can supplement, but truthfully, I don't know why you wouldn't just consume it as a beverage. And you can actually do a nettle infusion. I actually have some next to me right now, and it's very simple to do. You basically just brew hot water. You put the nettle leaves in the jar that you're going to use. I recommend using a glass jar. Pour the hot water over the nettle leaves and then leave that on the countertop with a lid over it. Don't tighten the lid, but just put the lid over it so you don't get flies and things in there, and leave it on the countertop for about 8 hours and then strain it. I like to use a cheesecloth. It's just the easiest way to go about it. Strain it into the jar and then transfer that to the fridge, and you can drink it cold. So you can do a couple cups of that per day, and it's just such a great way to get in all those minerals, the histamine benefits, and also block this 5-alpha pathway. You can also do spearmint tea. Spearmint tea can also be another 5-alpha blocker. It's also delicious, and I've even combined both of them together. You can do the spearmint with the nettle, so that's an option as well if you don't like the way that the nettle tastes on its own. And then EGCG, which is what's the main constituent in green tea, is also a 5-alpha blocker. So many different tea options that you have here. Green tea is also a really great option for the antioxidant benefits. So if you're looking to try to reduce oxidative stress, to get more antioxidants into your diet, or you're looking to improve egg quality, which is really dependent off of the amount of antioxidants that you consume, it may not be a bad idea to go the green tea route. So typically when we're working with clients, we're not going to pick all of these options. That could feel really overwhelming and probably isn't necessary. But based off of their situation and some of the different benefits that these various options have, it's kind of how we'll deduce what may be the best option for them. But I always recommend that if this is something that you're experiencing, test your progesterone metabolism so that you can see if this is even an issue for you. And then from there, you'll know, do I just need to support my 5-alpha pathway? And is it as simple as that to be able to help with this PMDD symptoms? Or do I need to look at either suppressing or increasing progesterone levels beyond that physiological level to be able to improve that symptomology in that mid-luteal and that late luteal phase? So that is PMDD, and you can see that most of it relates to mood and to cognitive related issues. Now, on the flip side with PMS, there is some crossover. With PMS, you may experience headaches, you may experience fatigue, some insomnia related symptoms, some depressive symptoms for a couple of days, but they're generally not going to be as debilitating and severe and be classified as a psychological condition like it would be with PMDD. So that is how you will know the differences between the two, or if you're working with a care provider, hopefully they'll be able to differentiate what is, the true thing that you are experiencing. With PMS, there is some hormonal cause that drives it, and then there's also some nutritional considerations to really take into account that can also be big drivers for what causes PMS to happen. So, as it relates to hormones, one of the big things that can cause PMS is an imbalance between estrogen and progesterone. Progesterone is really important for reducing prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are made in virtually every type of pain mechanism in the body. So if you sprain your ankle, the pain you feel is because of prostaglandins. There's good and bad prostaglandins though. Prostaglandins are what cause your uterus to contract to be able to shed your uterine lining so that you can even have a period. So if we didn't have prostaglandins, there would be no menstrual cycle. However, when those prostaglandin levels get too high, maybe because your resting state of inflammation is already pretty high, that's what leads to a lot of these high prostaglandin type symptoms. They're generally going to be more pain-related symptoms. So if you're thinking you have a prostaglandin-related issue, it's generally going to show up more as cramping, headaches, body aches, fatigue, right? More of these pain receptor type things rather than more mood-related changes. Now, they are elevated because there maybe isn't enough progesterone or because there's too much estrogen. Both situations can increase prostaglandins above the level that they should be. Having chronic inflammation can also be a big variable here too, and that's one of the reasons why we want to make sure that we're supporting your overall inflammation levels every day of the month, but that we're also understanding, are your estrogen and progesterone levels within balance of one another? Because when they're in balance of one another, you generally aren't going to have any issues with these prostaglandin-related symptoms. So these cramps can occur when your estrogen levels rise, progesterone levels are not adequate enough to counterbalance that estrogen, which we oftentimes think of as estrogen dominance. And progesterone works to alleviate these cramps by actually relaxing the uterine smooth muscles. So remember, progesterone can be very relaxing unless you have that paradoxical GABA response. It's going to be relaxing to everything. Your nervous system, it's going to make you feel calm, it's going to make you feel less anxious, and it's going to help your uterine muscles relax, which is going to prevent that cramping from occurring. So hormonally, prostaglandins can be a big driver. Estrogen in too much can be a big driver, and progesterone in too little of a quantity can also drive PMS symptoms. And sometimes I find for women that it's not so much that maybe they're not making enough progesterone, but there isn't an adequate progesterone production for a long enough period of time. Generally, we see this a lot with shorter cycles or with women that are ovulating really late, and then they're starting their period at day 28 or something. If you're ovulating on day 22 and you're starting your period on day 28, that's only 6 days of progesterone production. That's generally not enough to be able to counterbalance that estrogen that's been made for the last 20 something days. And then that can also lead to more of these prostaglandin related issues. Okay, let's talk about some of the nutritional things that can cause PMS. So we know that minerals are a big piece of this equation. We've talked about the role of minerals with the thyroid a lot, but they also can play a really important role as it relates to your PMS symptoms as well. Calcium has been shown to be an effective strategy for decreasing PMS pain, and disruption of how our body regulates calcium can actually be an underlying factor in recurrent period pain. So we want to make sure that we have the right balance of calcium. We also want to make sure that we have adequate magnesium, because magnesium helps sensitize our thyroid cells to being able to utilize iodine. Iodine is also a really important mineral. So mineral balance really does play a really important role here. And it's one of the reasons why we created our Mineral Magic supplement, because that actually provides you with a mineral complex of all of the minerals in their most bioavailable form, which means that they're the easiest for the body to absorb and utilize. And you're getting a wide variety that's in a very moderate dosage of everything. So they're all in the right ratios of one another to where we're not causing any mineral imbalances, but we're also enhancing the absorption of those minerals. And that's why we've left out things like iron, because if you supplement iron and calcium at the same time, you're actually neutralizing the effects of both of those minerals. So I'll link to Mineral Magic below, but it's one of my favorite things. I use it every single day. And I actually just break open the capsules and put them into my smoothie because I don't like taking capsules very much. But if you're a capsule person, then you can just take the 3 capsules per day at any point of the day. I just recommend not taking it alongside of iron or iron-rich foods so that you can enhance the absorption of that mineral on its own time as well. So they actually showed that when calcium and magnesium were combined together, there's a greater decrease in pain level. So it's a no-brainer, right? Make sure we have enough calcium, magnesium. You probably heard before that some of the reasons why you might crave things like dark chocolate before your period is because dark chocolate's a really high source of magnesium. It's a theory, right? I don't think there's anything to prove that that's why you crave it. But it could be one thing to explain that craving is because it does have that higher magnesium level and your body is needing more of that magnesium. Magnesium glycinate in particular can be a really helpful option to consider too, just because it's actually helping to be able to provide some of that relaxation to your smooth muscles as well. So kind of similar to what we talked about with the progesterone. And the glycine is actually just like what the magnesium is attached to. And glycine just has like a very calming effect on our nervous system overall. So that could be something to look at supplementing, especially if you're not getting enough through dietary sources. Omega-3s are also something really important to consider. Omega-3s are part of the family called essential fatty acids, and they are essential, meaning that your body cannot make them. So if you don't consume enough of them in your diet, you are deficient in them. And omega-3s actually function kind of more of like a hormone in the body than they do a nutrient, because they actually help regulate this whole prostaglandin signaling process. They play a really important role in prostaglandin production, and they do this through inhibiting an enzyme called a COX, COX, that produces prostaglandins. You might have heard of this enzyme before for anything like pain related that you've ever looked into in your lifetime, because it's the same enzyme that regulates pretty much all pain processes in the body. And omega-3s work directly on that enzyme to inhibit those prostaglandins. And again, remember that it's those prostaglandins that drive all of the uterine contractions and all of the pain receptors and things in your body. And this is one of the ways of how they work for period pain. Research shows that when you use them consistently for 3 months, women had experienced reduced symptom intensity and were also able to decrease the amount of ibuprofen that was used for period pain. So not only do I think omega-3s are essential to consume daily, because I will tell you, I have seen a lot of omega-3 indexes over the years, and I've never seen anyone who's been able to eat enough just through their diet without supplementation. So I think that they're important on a daily basis to prevent deficiency, but I think they're even more important in this like week time period leading up to your period to help with regulating this prostaglandin production. And what I like to do is even increase the dosage in that week leading up to it to make sure that you've got even more on board to be able to help inhibit those prostaglandins. You do want to be really careful about quality and sourcing with omega-3 fatty acids. They're not all considered equal, and there's a lot of sketchy companies out there. If you've ever, bought any cheap ones, you've probably noticed like fish burps and reflux and things and your breath smelling like fish. That's because they're just in the wrong form. So we really want to make sure that they're in the triglyceride form. You want to make sure that they're cold pressed. You want to know where they're also getting the omega-3s from. So my favorite company is Nordic Naturals. They have really great quality sourcing for all their products. It's actually who we source through for our omega-3 essential option, which I'll link to below as well. But they are based up in the Pacific Northwest, and they do a really good job of sourcing everything as sustainably and, taking all the right mechanisms to ensure that things stay cold pressed and in the best intact form. And then I recommend storing them in the fridge if you can. It's not 100% necessary, but if it does get hot in your house, or if you have them in the kitchen where you're cooking, the oven's on, then those omega-3s could oxidize, and that's when they no longer really have the benefits you're looking for. So it's best if you can make sure that they're stored in a cool place. So I personally just store mine in the refrigerator, and it seems to, do just fine in there in terms of storage and things. You could also look at reducing your exercise intensity in this time period. It can help reduce that cortisol response, especially for like PMDD. We talked about being a little bit more cortisol sensitive during this time period, but it can also help reduce those prostaglandins because intense exercise can increase those prostaglandins. So maybe turning to more low intensity things can be helpful, but I'd really listen to your body here. I definitely think, and I've seen in practice as well, that if people are doing a lot of like high intensity or really straining type exercise during this time period, it can definitely exacerbate a lot of these PMS symptoms. So it is better to be proactive rather than reactive. And then just remember that once you get through about like day 2 or 3 of your cycle, that's actually when you're in the best hormonal position to really push yourself with exercise because you're in a really low hormone output. So we kind of want to think about it as like the week before, maybe, doing some more low intensity things, taking a little bit of like a deload week, reducing the intensity of your workouts that you're doing. And then once you get through day 2 or 3 of your cycle, then that's where you can really push yourself a little bit more and your body can handle it a little bit better as well. Pushing yourself too much in those workouts during that time period can also increase your risk of what we call period flu. And this is a blog we actually just recently wrote on this, which I will link to as well below. But it's this kind of phenomenon where you can get sick more easily. And that's just because your immune cells are more sensitive during this time. And because of that high progesterone state, you are just more prone to getting sick if you come into contact with some type of virus. So we want to make sure that we're not pushing ourselves to the extreme because then that's going to make your immune cells even more sensitive and you're more likely to get sick. So if you're trying to prevent getting sick during this time of the month, then I would definitely recommend listening to your body and not pushing things more than what your body can handle, and just knowing that your body is going to have a little bit of delayed recovery because of all of the work that it's doing to be able to shed that uterine lining. That's a really energy intensive process. So a lot of these things can be foods that you're incorporating. There's so many calcium, magnesium rich foods out there. Bone broth or bone-in meats are a great way to get a lot of those minerals. Calcium also can come in the form of dairy options if that's something you're able to consume. Broccoli, kale also have tons of calcium. Magnesium you can get through pumpkin seeds and dark leafy greens and dark chocolate like we talked about. So tons of ways to get those. And then you can use something like Mineral Magic for just a daily supplemental kind of baseline support. Omega-3s you can get through all of your fatty fish. So salmon and sardines are really great options. You also get a little bit through grass-fed proteins. When the animal eats grass, they convert that over to omega-3s for you. So that is one of the benefits of choosing grass-fed and finished versus grain-fed and finished, is because you get that higher omega-3 content. And then of course you can also supplement in addition to that. And then with your exercise, this can be something that you look at. If you are part of our Strength and Hormones workouts, or if you're interested in it, I will link to that below. But those have a module in there in the course section of things that I've actually created for you guys, where it teaches you how to reduce that intensity in a really smart, methodical way in that week before to be able to maximize all these things that we talked about today. And that's a totally optional thing. I call that like our cycle syncing support. So if you want to tap into that, you can. You don't absolutely have to. Not everyone needs to make these modifications. But if you feel like these are things you're struggling with, like you're having a lot of PMS symptoms, it might be something to consider that could really go a big way in reducing those symptoms so that you don't feel as debilitated by the cramping and headaches and low mood and things of that sort during this time of the month. So I'm going to link to all those resources that I mentioned today. But if you guys have any questions on this topic, come let us know over on Instagram, and we'll see you guys back for another episode here shortly.